Okay, welcome everybody. It's now 2 o'clock on the East Coast, and I'm glad you're here for our alumni webinar. We'll let about one more minute go by, let people wander into the webinar, and we'll get started. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is Alex Bond from the Eno Center. We're here for our alumni webinar of the every other month. Very happy to be joined today by Gregg Moser. Gregg is with Krauthamer Associates, been there since 2005, and he's been really the point person on quite a few executive searches in the public transit industry, including, I'm assuming, quite a few of the people you work with. And I thought it'd be very important to bring someone like him to speak with our alumni about taking the next step in your career, which sometimes might be within your agency, sometimes it might be outside the agency. But one of the things Gregg's going to talk about today is how hiring at the executive level can be quite different from lower levels in the organization. So Gregg is an attorney and attended the University of Maryland for undergrad and actually for his JD. And has been practicing in since 2005 with Krauthamer Associates. And he's got our presentation now and planning your path to the C-suites. So Gregg, are you all the way hooked up and ready to go?
I'm all ready. Can you hear me okay, Alex?
Again, so everybody, we will get to questions at the end. We only about 17 people on the line, which is actually pretty good. And we'll maybe unmute for questions. But in the interim, please just enter your questions into the text box on your screen, and we'll get to those when Gregg is done. So Gregg, you want to take us away?
All right, thank you, Alex. I appreciate it, and thanks for the introduction, and thank you to everyone for joining today. It's certainly a topic and conversation that I get asked a lot about, and candidly, I think we all get busy in our daily lives, whether it's personal or professional, and don't take a moment to think about the next steps in our career until it's that opportunity where we want to really sit down and consciously make that decision. And I think that, part of my hope today in the discussion is that this doesn't need to be an overwhelming conversation you have with yourself or reflect upon from time to time, but one that, you should constantly look at and evaluate and think about, even if you're not looking for the next opportunity, because there will come that time where you do want to make a change and you do want to advance your career. And a lot of these things are building blocks that over time you acquire some of these skills, and you have to develop certain things that'll allow you, when you're ready to make that preparation for the leap, to possess. So I guess the first question, and this is an interesting question, as I have worked with different leadership programs, whether it's in transit or outside of transit, one question I often ask people is, do you want to be a CEO? And candidly, a lot of times in some of the leadership programs I've worked in, people have said to me at the beginning of those programs, well, I really do want to be a CEO. And then they go through the program, they talk to various CEOs, talk about their experiences, talk to people on the executive leadership team, get a better understanding, and really reflect on what that looks like in their own organization, what they've seen personally. And sometimes people don't ultimately decide that that's not the ultimate career goal. So I think it's important, where do you want your career to go? What is your ultimate goal? And what steps do you need to take to achieve that? And I think those are really two things that are very important in reflection, because it'll help guide you and determine, where you want to go and how you want to get there. And I think it'll lean itself to other questions as well, in terms of size of agency or public or private sector and whatnot. As you think about being a CEO, I don't think it's necessary to literally sit down with a piece of paper and write down with two columns pros and cons per se, but I think it is important to evaluate and think about what those advantages and disadvantages are. I mean, in the public transit arena, I can't think of too many cases where the CEO is not the highest income earner in the organization. The COO or anybody down below typically earns less than the CEO. So that may be a pro, earning a high level of compensation. The cons may be having to report to a board of directors, which is 7, 9, 15, 25 people. Do you want 25 bosses? A lot of times, as you all know, the CEOs are the front of the organization. They're the face of the organization. They automatically take credit when things go well, and they also take the heat when things get tough. So, and another con potentially is job security. If you're a COO or head of bus or head of rail, or you're in public affairs or communications or marketing, and you're the heads of those organizations, a lot of times those positions are typically a bit more protected than the CEO position. Now, that's not always the case. There are situations where a new CEO comes in and wants to build out their own executive team. So I'm certainly appreciative and aware that there's no job security in any position. But the CEO position oftentimes has a little bit more risk, but it also has its advantages as well. What avenues can you take to be a CEO? There are many different ways. And, my experience having done recruitments for large, medium, and small organizations is traditionally the larger agencies, not always, but traditionally tend to go outside of their agencies. I mean, if you look at the Martas of the world, you look at BARTs and you look at New York Cities, and, typically the deputy doesn't necessarily become the CEO. And that's not always the case. There have been cases at BART. There are cases at SEPTA where deputies or heads of engineering have gone on to become the CEO. But by and large, I'd say the majority of the bigger sized agencies, typically because of politics, because a lot of things that are not even factors of the agencies themselves or their staff or their employer, pushing pressure on those organizations. And it's safer for the elected officials or the boards who have been appointed by elected officials or sit on the board because they are elected officials, to say, well, we brought someone in from another community where they've proven they've been able to do something. Medium and smaller size agencies are more inclined to promote from within. They don't necessarily have the resources to go out and do a large scale recruitment or spend money on relocation. And oftentimes, they're more reflective on having a strong team and everybody's rolling up their sleeves, and oftentimes they tend to promote from within. As you think about what's important to you, I think it's also important to look at the personal side of this, which is, do I have a family? Are my friends in this area? Do I like the community I live in? Do I like the weather, the climate, the personal and non-business aspects of the community, and maybe cultural, maybe arts and things like that? Are those important to me to stay in this particular community, or am I willing to be mobile? The more mobile you can be, and your agencies might not want to hear this, but the more mobile you can be, the more opportunities are open for you. And I think every agency out there, while they may not want to lose you as an executive, certainly recognizes that growth and development for one's career is helped by the fact that you can go somewhere else. You can get different perspectives from another organization, from the politics in that particular community. I've worked with transit agencies all over the country where people have left and actually come back, and they've been hired back for even CEO jobs later on in their career, where they left for 2, 3, 5 years, and then were brought back in where they had spent their entire career prior to that at that one particular agency. And the growth that they were able to go through and did go through during that time when they left afforded them that opportunity to come back. And I've even had board members say to me that they probably wouldn't have looked at this person internally had they not left the organization and been interested in coming back. Another avenue to go about advancing your career and whether you want to be at the C-level or not is to go into the private sector if you're in the public sector right now, or vice versa. Again, it just offers you a diverse set of skills. We're seeing more in public transit these days, doing more with less, having to figure things out. There's not as many federal dollars or state or local dollars being given to public transit agencies. We're having to think about these businesses more like a business. So I'm seeing more and more agencies out there interested in people that have private sector experience. The one drawback I will say is that if you only had private sector experience, one of the drawbacks is coming into the public sector side, particularly in the operations and engineering area, is not having a large scale management experience. And so when I do work with some of the larger agencies where there may be 50, 100, 300, 1,500 people reporting into a position, and they may not all be direct reports, but the broader management structure for that organization. When I find somebody who's got good technical experience and they've worked for one of the private sector companies and have never managed a large team, that tends to be a challenge. So think about that and reflect upon that as you think about your career and what you want to try to gain. Another thing I typically find is when someone leaves the public side and they go to the private side and they've been out for 5, 7, 10 years in the private side, well, that skill set is really valuable and they may be involved in really critical things. Oftentimes agencies look at them as an outsider. They look at them as a consultant and they don't look at them as a transit agency professional. And so, that's really important if you do decide to make that leap, to think about how, if your ultimate goal is to get back into an agency, how to do that and what's the appropriate amount of time to spend outside of the organization before you jump back into the organization, so you don't come across as having lost that operational touch. And then I think the other thing is to think about the large versus medium versus small agencies. It can be hard to go from a small agency to a large agency. And sometimes I've talked to people who have been CEOs at smaller medium agencies. They've gone to become a deputy CEO at a larger agency and then had the opportunity to move up. So sometimes it may look on paper like you've taken a step back in your career, but to get to that bigger agency where you ultimately want to be, the responsibilities and the impact can actually be larger. So I have seen people actually take a step back to go up and make a step forward because of the fact that they wanted to go to a larger agency, or vice versa. They've been at a large agency as a number two, and they're not really qualified or ready to be a CEO for a large agency, at least from the perspective of maybe their board of directors. And they go to a smaller agency where they can roll up their sleeves, and that particular agency has a specific need that's very much in line with their experience, and they're interested in hiring them to come in and manage the agency and also use those experiences and their professional talents to be able to address whatever that area might be. It might be finance, might be a maintenance issue or whatnot. I think another thing that's really important, and this is what I was touching on when I started my conversation earlier on about planning for the future, is building your brands. And it's very easy to not think about this in our daily lives, and we see it time and time again. We see this with elected officials. You see, if you go to Fox News or CNN or any of the news in the New York Times, we see constantly people who have damaged their brand and tarnished their reputation in a moment's notice. And, I think that we have to be very cognizant as professionals about what our brand is and what kind of brand do we want to convey. And it's something that we're constantly working on. I often say this to people, your brand and who you are starts with your board. And people ask me, well, how can I have a brand when I'm born? I can't control what I do when I'm 2, 3, 4 years old. Well, that may be true, but a lot of it's also based on where you grew up and based on what your family dynamics are. I've had people come to me and, their parents were bus operators and never went to college, and they were the first generation of family members that ever went to a college or university. That's part of their brand. That's something to be said about the fact that, that family rallied around one another and got that person, their child, to be able to go to college. It's a great success story. So our brand is really who we are and what we've tried to accomplish and all of that. And, our brand continually evolves. It's something that we're always working on, whether you have children or you're in a relationship or you've dedicated yourself to a faith-based organization, or you volunteer on the side, whatever it may be. Those are all components of who you are and what your brand is, and it says something about you. So, part of what helps develop and build your brand is not just what you do in the daily lives of delivering service in your organization or, balancing the budget or putting out a communications message or whatnot, but it's also what do you do outside of the organization? What do you do when you leave the office at 5, 6, 7 o'clock at night or on the weekends when you're not working? Those sorts of things. Those are part of who you are, what your brand is, and how you present yourself to your broader community. This next slide touches on different areas of your brand. It's your personality. How do you carry yourself in the office? Are you the person that's always joking and cracking a joke in a meeting? Are you the person that's always serious and can't, present that softer side? How do you appear? I've seen people walk through offices and they're in a suit and tie every day. What does that say about you wearing a suit and tie every day? Or the person who, is is constantly dressed down and not dressed, all of those things. There are people who are wearing the latest fashion, and all of these sorts of things dictate what our brand is, how we present ourselves, what people perceive about ourselves. Communication skills. I mean, we've all heard stories where someone says like or and those sorts of things also dictate part of your brand and part of your personality, your technical competencies. And then I think it goes to our integrity and our honesty and commitment to an organization. And again, those are the things that, we all know this, if you have an employee who works for you and they do something that's dishonest, or they don't tell the truth, or they're not forthright, they're not transparent, everybody remembers the bad things. You could have 100 good times and one bad time and they'll remember that, and they won't let it go. And so, we all make mistakes. And I think that that's part of it. As long as there's integrity and there's honesty behind what we do, I think that there's a lot of value in walking into someone's office and say, look, I made a mistake here, and owning that mistake. In that case, I think as long as there was integrity behind it, you weren't trying to do something dishonest, I think that there's forgiveness, and people do understand those sorts of things. This next area that I talked about is the actual interview and going through the interview process. And one thing I'll say is we're all seeing this. The interview process at the CEO level, and I'll talk about the levels below the CEO, but the CEO level are more and more scrutinized because of the fact that more information is easily accessible. I can't tell you how many times I do searches now where the board says to me, do a social media trace. And, the easy one is to put in a name like Gregg Moser into Google and just see what populates. But I'm getting asked now to look at Instagram and look at Facebook and look at Twitter and all of the other vehicles out there. And so don't think just because you have your account blocked or your account private that someone can't get access to it, because I can tell you that I've had candidates whose accounts are blocked or private. They've given me access. They've given me permission. And I found board members who have found ways of getting to that information roundabout. So it could be, and you need to ask, well, how is that possible? Well, they may have a friend who has a friend in some other community who's connected to you that you didn't even realize that particular board member or that executive knew. It's a colleague of yours in your organization, and you gave them access to your account, and then they ask, well, send me some screenshots of what that looks like. So make sure whatever you have out there, if you have an account, is professional. I don't think there's anything wrong with being at a social event and having a drink in your hand, but those things where you're at the Sunday afternoon football game and there's pictures of you continuously of drinking beers and stuff like that. I mean, I think that, that says something. It's part of your brand. It's part of who you are. And, they're thinking from their standpoint, okay, what is this person going to do when they're in my community? Are they going to be the ones seen at the stadium drinking beers all Sunday afternoon and being our CEO of our organization? I see less of that at the deputy levels, at the executive leadership levels, but I still, and you have to remember from the CEO's standpoint, they want to manage their risk, because if they hire someone that has information like this out there, and whether it's their board member or a community member or the media that finds this stuff, they're going to dig it up. And people love to sensationalize things. They love to spin things in a way that may not portray everything, and it'll catch you up in that situation, and candidly, it'll catch your CEO up in that situation. I'm also seeing on the CEO interview side more and more processes where the process itself is public. Part of that is dictated by laws, local laws, like the state of Florida has sunshine laws where nothing from employee matters can be done in executive session. And then I have other organizations where their states or their local communities don't require it, but they do because, again, they are elected officials, or they have been appointed by a mayor or a governor or city council, and they feel compelled, even though it's their process, they feel compelled to give that transparency to their community. So as you reflect on a CEO recruitment and whether you want to go forward with one, whether I'm involved or another search firm is involved or no search firm is involved, one of the things you want to ask is, what is this process going to look like? Is there a chance my name could get out there? When will my name get out there? What sorts of protections will be put in place to prevent my name from getting out there? And I think those are all appropriate questions, because candidly, it's your reputation and your career that's at risk. And so if an organization or person isn't comfortable sharing that and being transparent about that, I'd ask twice whether that's something I want to go through a process, because if your name gets leaked out there, you may have to go back to your organization and say, hey, look, I did apply for this. And, and then the question is, do they appreciate that? Or do they say, well, this person's looking around, maybe it's time for them to move on? So I think these are all questions you want to ask yourself and think about. And the most important thing in any interview, whether it's a CEO interview or an executive interview or even mid-level manager, if you're coaching some of your staff and whatnot, is know who your audience is, know who you're walking in with. So if you're walking into a CEO interview, ask whoever's involved in your point person, who are the players, who are the stakeholders that are going to be involved in this? Who's going to be interviewing me? Same thing if you go into interview for a deputy position. Ask the people, is there a panel of executives who are going to interview me? What are their titles? What are their roles? I think it's a fair and appropriate. I've candidly had clients that I've worked with who have said, don't tell the candidates. We don't want them to do the background and diligence. We don't want them to maybe reach out to those people. We don't want them to reach out to someone else who might know those people and influence the process. But I think it's a fair question to ask. And I would say most of the time they'll share that information with you so that you can do your diligence and you know who your audience is you're speaking to. And you can think about it as you're thinking about joining this organization and you're going to be one of the key players in this organization, how can you support and help them through the role that you're considering to be hired for? This last part, negotiating compensation, is one that, I get calls all the time, even when I'm not involved in searches, from people who are making career changes. And they say, well, Greg, how do I negotiate my compensation? And what do I do? How do I ask for something like this? And it's really tough. I mean, I don't think I've met a person who feels comfortable pushing and asking for more money. It's part of our society. It's part of our culture. It's part of us as inherently as people, we feel uncomfortable talking about money and asking about money and things like that. But it's one of these things that you need to be prepared for because you have to be your own advocate. And you want to make sure that at the time where a job is offered to you, you've thought about all the avenues to advocate for yourself. One thing I'm seeing more and more and I've seen it in California and actually state of New York, I think that the governors have passed executive orders in those two states, and I wouldn't be surprised to see more gaining traction in this area, is in public sector, particularly transit agencies. They will no longer ask you what your salary is. And one of the reasons for that is that there's been a lot of discussion and there's a lot of fact-based proof that women and minority candidates have been undercompensated over time against their white male counterparts because of the fact that they've started at a lower salary and they haven't been given the equal salaries to those other people. Whether that's accurate or fair or unfair, the fact remains that some of these organizations and some of these states have passed laws or put checks and balances in place so that they can't ask you for that information. So that has a huge advantage for someone who, like, let's say you're making $80,000 and they offer you $150. They might never have done that before. If they had known you were making $80, they probably wouldn't have offered you $150. But the reverse plays true too, where you may be making $150 and the position only pays $115. And so one of the things I think is really important as you think about going through a process, whether, again, there's a recruiter involved or you've been just contacted or you apply for a job, is try to figure out what the compensation is for the position and understand that those organizations may not ask what you're earning because they're not allowed to. But what's the point of going through a 3, 4, 5, 6 month process with an organization to find out they can't pay you what you're worth or what you're earning right now? So make sure you ask and you get some general guidance and think about things. They oftentimes, whether they're an internal recruiter or an HR person or you've applied for a job, they're not always checking all the boxes. So you have to be your own advocate. For example, if you're in California and you're part of CalPERS and you go to another organization in California that's not part of CalPERS, that might not make financial sense for you. You know, as you think about your long-term succession planning, your long-term retirement, again, why go through a 6-month process to find out they don't have the same retirement program you do and you can't leave yours because you have sort of golden handcuffs from them. So those are things that are really important to think about and consider as you get contacted or as you apply for a job. Think about those things early before the job's offered to you. I put up on the screen different areas of compensation. Obviously, some of these apply to some organizations and some apply to other ones. Like, for example, most public transit agencies out there don't have bonuses. On the flip side, a lot of private sector organizations don't have pensions. So these are areas where I think it's important to make a list of what's important to you so that you're prepared to have a conversation with someone. I don't think you need to go and share every detail right up front, but I do think it's important to pick out the ones that are most important to you. For example, a pension program. If you're in a pension program, I think it's fair to be honest with someone and say, look, I'm in a pension program. If I walk away today, this is what could happen, and this is what it would cost me to make me whole on that. So I've done recruitments for organizations where someone does end up leaving a pension program, but we had to pay them $20,000 or $25,000 more a year to make up for the fact that they weren't adding another year's worth of service to that pension program they were in before. So those are things to think about and are really important. These are also areas where you can maybe negotiate with someone. So they may come back and there may be some benefits that are set in stone. For example, healthcare. You may not be able to get a better contribution towards the monthly healthcare premium. So maybe the employer puts in $300 and you have to put in $100. A lot of organizations, you can't negotiate your $100 contribution down, but you might be able to get an extra week of vacation time, or you might be able to negotiate into their a period of severance at the end. You might be able to negotiate into their an increase in salary before the next year. If I do well and I have a performance review in 6 months, and that might be a negotiation between the two of you. Well, okay, I'm making 165 right now. I'm willing to come over and make 165 right now. If in 6 months you could move me up to 170, and then my year time I go up to 175. Again, things like that, you may be able to have some discussion with whoever it is you're negotiating with to try to get yourself into an organization and move up, whereas they might have started and just said, well, we want to bring you in at 165, and then next year we'll relook at it. So these are all sorts of things you can think about and talk about, but make a list of what's important to you and what you're willing to sacrifice on and not sacrifice on. I think from there, I imagine there's a couple questions out there. I'm certainly happy to answer any that might come up, and thank you.
Thanks, Greg. That's great. We have a few questions, and please type them into the question box. We have close to a half an hour to go through them, so plenty of time for that. I guess the first one, it's kind of a question that popped in my head really quick, but what levels tend to have a contract, right? You went over some of the ways you're compensated. So what levels or what titles tend to have a contract versus, falling into public pay bands?
Yeah, so typically in the public sector, it's typically the CEO that has a contract most often. I've seen a few organizations out there where the deputy, the C-level suite right below there has a contract. And I've seen organizations that had them before and they've done away with them. And I've seen some that did away with them and brought them back. So you would say, well, why would they do away with them? Well, they do away with them because it's more flexible to remove someone, and they don't have a contract that has a defined amount of severance. And you'd say, okay, well, why would they have one? And it's just the flip, right? If you can get someone under contract, there's no penalty that the employee would have to pay back something if they decide to leave. But there are ways to put golden handcuffs in there that are unique, and it may be something you can negotiate. They might even want to put in something that you have to give them a 90 or 120-day notice period. And again, it's hard to enforce that, but the theory behind it is, someone's not going to walk out the door in 30 days. It'll make it more challenging for them to find another employer who's willing to wait 4 months once they give notice to leave.
Right. Thanks. Okay. So this question, why, in the grand scheme of things in your field, why do agencies use executive recruiters for certain roles? And then the kind of corollary to that I'm going to add on, this is a moderator's privilege. In the end, who does the recruiter work for?
Yeah. So agencies will use them for a number of reasons. One is they don't have the internal resources or capacity to do the recruitment. That's one reason. The second reason is it provides them coverage. So if the HR person doesn't, let's say BART is recruiting a head of rail operations. The logical places to look are places like WMATA. Well, WMATA is somewhat of a peer agency. So rather than the head of HR at BART calling LA and calling Atlanta, and they put a recruiter out there to do that. So it gives them coverage in that way, and particularly at the CEO level. And on the private side too, I've had people call me and say, hey, look, I know a lot of people in this industry. I want coverage. I want you to be able to talk to them and let them have the bad news versus me being the one to communicate that bad news. So those are oftentimes why people come. We've got relationships out there, and I know a lot of people, and I've got a good pulse on the marketplace. People will call me and say, hey, Greg, if you see an opportunity, I'd love to be considered. So I keep track of that information, and I reach out to folks constantly. So, my outreach and my resources, since I do that on a daily basis, is a little bit stronger than the organization. Other reasons, because of what I do, I can field and this ties into your question, Alex, about who do I work for. I can field questions from both sides. So as a candidate, you might be really frustrated with the fact that they're only offering X amount of money. And I can have a conversation with you and I can help manage your expectations and say, look, here was exactly what your peers in the organization are making, and here's the reasons why they can't. But let me go back to the organization with some of the reasons why it's important to you. And I can be that middle person and pull the frustration and the emotion out of the conversation and have a dialogue with both sides to try to bring them to a place where everyone doesn't just throw up their arms. And candidly, the success there is once you get there, everybody forgets about the conversations that took place. And again, there was an emotion. And these are people you have to work with on a daily basis once you get there. So allowing me to have those conversations and work through it, it puts on me versus having to put it on you. The question about who do I work for, the short answer is the client that's my client. And I have a fiduciary responsibility to them. I sign a contract with them. I have certain things I have to do to adhere to that contract and to manage their expectations. But at the same time, while they're the ones paying me, while I have a contract with them, my responsibility is to the candidate also for multiple reasons. One is I want the search to be successful for everyone. And I use this term a lot, I'd rather have the divorce before the marriage. The last thing I want is for someone to get there and not be happy because, one, they've committed a lot of resources, not just my fee, but a lot of resources to bringing this person on board. And if it doesn't work out, they got to go back through that process again. And if it doesn't work out for the candidate, they just gave up a job and maybe moved to their family or moved themselves, and now they're not happy. And so I'd rather figure out all the reasons why this might be risk to both sides and try to manage that up front. And the other thing is, I really do believe this. I live and die by my reputation, and recruiting is not a perfect science. And sometimes things come up that we don't expect. But, to me, I want to make sure the candidate is fully satisfied and really happy. So at the next time I have to come back, they can say, Gregg was great. Doing this recruitment, I had a great experience and I would work with him again. So I think that while the recruiter has a responsibility to their client, there's an important reason why you should feel comfortable talking to them and relying on them and trust them that they're going to do the right thing for you.
Right. Okay, but we got some questions starting to pour in now. People got their fingers on the keyboard. The first question is really about resumes and kind of the current trend in the HR world. What features should they have? Are they more high level? How much detail? How many pages are acceptable? And in your opinion, does design and format matter?
Yeah. So there's no perfect resume out there. I think for an executive level, for at this stage of your career, it's okay to have a multi-page resume. I think it's actually probably more appropriate to have a multi-page resume than a one-page resume. Now, I would think about, and I can't answer that for every single person that is on the phone today, but is a 2-page resume, is a 3-page resume, and why do you need 4, 5, 6, 7 pages if it's beyond 2 or 3? If you've done a lot of publications, you've done a lot of speaking things, you could potentially create an addendum to your resume that's not part of the true resume. I think that people love to see accomplishments, and I'm not just saying manage a team of 25 people, but improve from A to B. People want to see how have you been able to improve an organization, how have you been able to change something, how have you been able to drive success. And so those are important things. A lot of times I see resumes and they're very soft-spoken, and so I did this and I did this, but if you can quantify what you did, if there are metrics, talk about those metrics. But make sure when you talk about those metrics, they're accurate metrics. So if they get a copy of a report you're referring to, it's accurate. Don't if you're using numbers, be accurate on the numbers. The other thing I'll say about a resume is, well, 2 things. Make it so it's easy on the reader's eye. It's just like going into an art museum. You look at a painting for 10, 15 seconds, and if that painting gets 15 or 20 seconds of your time, it's lucky. And so it's the same thing with your resume. They may get for a particular recruitment 20, 30, 50, 200, 500 resumes. They're not going to sit and look. I mean, they're going to screen out that first batch, but they're going to quickly go through those next ones. And so you want to capture the reader's eye. Make it easy for them to see. Bold your job, your current employer, or your employers in the past as well, and your title so it pops out. At BART and I'm the Chief Transportation Officer, so they can see that clearly and quickly. Make sure if you have an education on there, your experience is on there. Make sure it's accurate, and definitely make sure that the punctuation and the grammar and the spelling is correct. And have multiple people read your resume because people glance at things and they'll catch different things. And just make sure you've got all of that stuff really, really well taken care of.
Great. So here's a two-part question, actually talking a little bit about contracts, asking what's the typical length of a new CEO's contract, and then on the other end, for someone in the C-suite, what is a typical severance?
So I'm seeing typical contracts usually of 3 and 5 years. That's typical. I've seen some 7s, but they're usually 3 or 5 years. I've seen automatic renewals. I've seen 3 with 2 one-year options. I've seen some that don't have a defined period of ending. So I've seen some, and I've seen these even in California, where they're unlimited contracts. So someone is hired as a CEO, and there's no point in time where that contract expires. So the advantage of that is that's great. That means the only way they can get rid of you is by breaking the contract. The disadvantage of that is there's no incentive in the contract to sit down, as it's structured like that, to sit down and have a conversation about when to increase salary or to change the compensation, because it's an ongoing contract. But theoretically, in a contract that doesn't have a defined term to it, the only way they can remove you is either for cause. And if there's not for cause, then if there's a severance provision, there's severance tied to it. The question about severance, it depends on the size of the organization. The bigger, more complicated political organizations typically go with a year. I've seen a couple cases, I'm seeing fewer and fewer of these where it's been 2 years. I've seen more and more organizations going to 6 months, particularly the mid-sized agencies. And I've seen a few out there at 3 months. And I know the state of Florida, I think, has a 20-week, 5-month provision by law for any public agency. And so obviously you want to negotiate for as much time as you can get. I've seen some where they're tiered also, like the first year or 2 is 12 months, and then year 3 is 6 months, and year 4 is 3 months, and then year 5 is 0 because it's the end of the contract, so to speak. I saw a question on here. Sorry, Alex.
No, go ahead.
No, I saw a question about different paths for people to get to higher positions in transit systems and not just CEOs. There are many ways. One of the ways, and I've seen this in a couple of the agencies, and it really is dictated by the CEO and the culture they're trying to create, but it's kind of the Southwest Airlines model, where they're willing to rotate executives through different positions. And it's not done too often, particularly in the public sector. But if you work for an organization like that, I highly encourage you to try to get in other areas. And talk to your CEO about expanding your experience, whether it's formal or informal, like they just give you another project to work on, or they formally change you to a different role. Advocate for that on behalf of yourself. Take on that responsibility. Obviously, like I said, geographic movement. So if you go from LA to San Francisco, you can move into a different position. And it may be hard to go from a chief financial officer to a chief mechanical officer, because one has mechanical engineering experience and one's got finance experience. But to the extent you can gain more experience in managing budgets, managing a P&L, profit and losses, managing employees, I'd highly encourage people to do that. I think that, the agencies out there, when you want to go to a COO level, they want to see multimodal experience. They want to see professional experience. They want to see you taking on other additional responsibilities. So stretch your wings and apply for jobs that may not be that traditional job. But be understanding, too, that they may be looking for a very specific type of person out there. And the more information you can get from the recruiter or the organization as to what they're looking for in that particular job may help you better understand whether you could apply for a job in another agency that's got a different set of skills. And again, talk to your employer, and if you're in a senior management role but you're not at the executive role yet, and there are 4 or 5 of your peers in your same department, talk about moving over to one of those other areas and gaining something. So maybe you're in power and you want to go over to track, something like that. I'm making this up. Or you're in audit and you want to go to some other area of finance, or you're in bus and you want to move to rail. I mean, I see that happening all the time. And to the extent you can gain that other mode or that other area of experience, I think is really, really critical and really valuable skill.
Great. There's a question here, an interesting one. I think it really gets to the fact that most people are looking for jobs in a closely defined period. But the question here is, any advice for juggling interviews or offers that come simultaneously or near simultaneously? I've maybe had, how do you, or should you, play offers against each other, for example?
Yes, great question. And actually, I deal with this a lot because right now there's high demand and low supply of really good talent out there. And I really do believe that. I mean, we see it at the CEO level. I see it at the executive levels. And so from an employee standpoint, we're all in a very good place right now because the economy has been doing very well. The unemployment rate is low. And more and more people are starting to retire, and we're not getting that technical talent. So to the extent you have technical talent, you're in a very good position. I think that, and I say this, I think it's really important to help manage expectations because I always ask people, are there other opportunities you're looking at right now, and how imminent are those? And I don't need to know as a recruiter what those opportunities are. I don't need to know you're talking to AECOM and Sistra and STV all at the same time. That to me is not the important part. But to me it is, I've got another organization I'm talking to, and I expect to have an offer within the next 2 weeks. That's what they've indicated to me. To me, I can help go and manage my client and help them say, hey, look, if you want to be competitive and you want to be manage timing, this is what's going on the other side. It's certainly more difficult as an employee or a candidate to do that if you don't have somebody in the middle. But I think it's fair to say to someone, hey, look, I am looking at multiple things right now, and one of them is fairly close. Again, you can just let them know a little bit of information because you don't want to blindside someone. And I think they'll appreciate that. And candidly, you may get them to move faster. And I'm not suggesting you make that up, but if there's legitimate other opportunities, just let them know, hey, I am looking at some other things. I just want to let you know that some of these other things are starting to pick up speed. In terms of negotiating against one another, you have to understand where these employers are coming from. So, geography, particularly in the public sector, there's internal equity issues. There's salary bands. There may be budget constraints. On the private sector side, it may be salary, but it may be other things too. Like one of them might be a smaller organization with a lot more upside, whether it's financial upside or equity in the company, or it might just be that the company's rapidly growing. They've got a great reputation and a great brand. Might be that they have an opportunity in the United States and they do work internationally and they can move you there as well if you wanted to do something like that. So think about what it is and if you feel comfortable saying, hey, I have an offer from some such and such, and these are the terms, and if you can get to that, I'm willing to take the job. I don't think there's any reason why you shouldn't do that, as long as you do it professionally and you do it with respect and understanding. And they may just say, I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do. We can't get there, and you have to be ready for that sort of thing. And the timing in which you do that also is really important, because if you start to do some of that before you even have an offer, they may just say, you know what, let them go to the other organization. They're further along. We can't match those numbers. So I think, again, it's important to manage throughout the process and decide at what time is the right time to pull the trigger on conveying some of that information.
Good advice. Okay. Next one here. I'll just read it off. How do you deal with transit systems asking for 20 years of experience? Specifically, how do you counteract that if you haven't worked in, say, transit for 20 years, if you have 20 years of experience, or maybe in transportation for the adequate number of years? But is there a way to address that in your application or interview process?
Yep. So I'll even take that one step further. I have a client right now who, if you don't have a college degree or a degree, an advanced degree, they will still consider you, but they double the amount of experience required for the job. So if it says 10 years minimum experience, you don't have a degree, it's now 20 years, right? And so sometimes there's no way to manage that. There's nothing you can do. If you've got 18 years and they say 20, there are organizations out there that will just say, I'm sorry, they don't have enough experience. I will tell you from a recruiter standpoint, that's unbelievably frustrating because, and I'm sure for a candidate standpoint, you could be unbelievably talented and you might be just shy of that amount of experience, and they say, I'm sorry, we can't consider you. And if that's the case, then it wasn't meant to be in the first place. Even though you might want to work in that organization, you may just have to wait another 2 years or so. I think that if you don't have a recruiter or someone involved and you're applying for the job, you can address those sorts of things in your cover letter. You could address it in the email you send if you send it, if there's an ability to send an email into something. Is it right or good to acknowledge it up front and say, look, I understand, and you may not use these exact words, but I recognize I don't have 20 years of experience, but I've got this and this and this to match that. Perhaps, I'm not sure the wording, as long as, again, you do it professionally and you do it respectfully, is going to torpedo your application. If they're not interested in you because you don't have the amount of experience, there's nothing you can say or do that's going to get you there. But I will also say, don't sell yourself short, because there are often times it says 20 years and people just won't apply because they've got 18 years. Put your application in. What's the worst thing you have to lose? They don't call you, and if they do call you, ask the question, hey, I saw it when I applied for this, it did say 20 years. I put it in because I'm pretty close to that. Is that going to be a problem as we get further along in the process? Just make sure, because again, you don't want to spend 6 months going down a path and then someone didn't look at it closely and went, oh. But as you think about hiring people too, and I talk to clients about this at the CEO level and below, I oftentimes say, keep your posting, your job posting, as broad as possible. You as the hiring manager have the ability and the authority to decide what you ultimately want to hire. But if you say job, advanced degree required, and you find the best candidate out there and they don't have an advanced degree, well, what are you going to do? Because now you've hired someone without an advanced degree, and it subjects you to liability for other candidates who had advanced degree or didn't have advanced degrees who didn't apply for the job because they saw advanced degree. So to me, if you're going to hire employees, make your hiring process as broad as you possibly feel you can, because you can open the pool up to anybody, and then you can narrow it down once you look at the application.
Right. And the original question asker agrees with your latter part of your statement. That there's such a shortage of employees. Hopefully people are more open-minded when they do put these together. I have the biggest two-part question here to wrap up. If anybody else has others, please type them in. There is one. Wait, another one from... that's a good point from the original question asker, that there is sometimes a gender difference. She points out that sometimes women will choose not to apply for certain things because they don't meet every bullet point. Sometimes it might be a different perspective for men that are applying. So, good point. I'm trying to keep everybody anonymous in this. So, here we go. Last question here. So, people are interested... if you move from a higher position to a lower position in an organization, is that viewed really negatively? And how do you address that if it's brought up during an interview? Maybe you should bring it up on your own. And how can you kind of turn that around and make it positive?
So I think that life isn't perfect, and we all go through, there can be a tough time. You could get laid off as a CEO, again, because of the risks, and you didn't do anything wrong. But the political winds changed, and so you got laid off, and you have a family, or you have yourself to support, for that matter. You got to get a job, and so it was competitive. There aren't a lot of CEO jobs. I mean, right now there may be 4 or 5 of them in the country, but there may be 15 people looking at those same 4 or 5 jobs. So part of getting a CEO job is luck. A lot of times, it's beyond just your technical skills. Some of it's just luck, and really how you resonate with that group. And there's nothing you could do to prepare for that. And I've seen boards not pick people for the most obscure reasons. And again, it's nothing you could have done that would have changed the process if you had prepared differently. And so sometimes you need a job, and you go out and you take a job that's of a lesser experience. Or sometimes you just decide to get to that next level, you've stepped back. And I think it's important to explain and let people know it. There's nothing to be ashamed of. I mean, if they don't like it, then I think you have to really reflect, is this the place I want to be, right? If they don't support the kind of person I am and what I've done to take care of myself and to advance my career, then is that the kind of organization I want to work with? And I know that's sometimes easy to say and hard when you're in a situation, but it's true. And I'd explain it. I mean, there may be personal circumstances. Maybe you had a significant other that I've had people who had significant other had to move to another geographic area because of a job or family. They've had to take care of elderly parents. And they gave up one job, and it's not even a CEO job. Maybe they were a deputy, and they went back into a mid-level management job. I think it's okay to explain those sorts of things and tell people and be upfront about it. Don't keep the white elephant in the room, so to speak. And sometimes people I've had candidates that had children that have gone through, some sort of medical condition. They had to move to Houston because they needed the best medical care that in Houston offered that, whatever it might be. And so there are reasons why people do that, and we all have our reasons why we chose to make that decision, because we all have a choice in life, whether we're going to take that job that's lower or not. And so, again, I think it's okay to explain that and be open about it and transparent, and don't leave them guessing, well, they must have got fired from this one, and that's why they took this other job, or they really weren't good at that higher level, so that's why they stepped back. I mean, if you don't explain it, then they're going to start to wonder, and the first thing people question is, they start to make up their own reasons, and it's typically because this person wasn't good enough, and it might very well not be that.
Okay. So I have one last question, and then I'm going to tell everyone, though, how to find this stuff. First off, Gregg doesn't have his email on this last slide, but I want to make sure everybody has it. It's posted there in the chat box. It's gmoser@kapartners.com. It's also out there if you want to click through. I realize this is a sometimes sensitive topic, so Gregg has made himself available if anybody has questions or would like to continue the conversation. This webinar, the recording of it, will be posted out on the Alumni website. If you have an login, you'll be able to pull it down along with all of our other Alumni webinars. And keep an eye out for future webinars. Usually we try to do these every other month, and we have our virtual reading roundtables as well, where we talk about leadership concepts and some of the literature that's out there on that. So we have a couple of other questions here. I think the first one here, any advice on tactfully lining up references in a way that is kind of protects you, make sure you have a round set of references without exposing your search for a new position?
Yeah, it's actually a great question, and I should actually address that as some of these slides as time goes on, because I deal with that all the time also. I think at the executive level, again, whether you're a CEO or just going for an executive position, at this point in your career, unless there's some sort of relevancy to the job, community, like for example, if you're going to be a CEO and you have to deal in that particular community very closely with the business community, the faith-based community, I think personal references aren't necessarily appropriate, unless it's a situation like I just talked about. So make sure they're professional, make sure they're people that have worked with you, and make sure they're recent. So I've had people give me a reference and I look at their resume and it was 17 years ago. And so I question and I say to them, you're telling me you can't refer one other person that you've worked for in the last 17 years? And people will say, well, I've been at the same organization. I've been at, Krauthamer for 15 years. Well, has anybody ever left that you worked for, that you still keep in touch with? I mean, so make sure they're relevant, make sure they're recent. I think it's really good to give, like, someone you've worked for, give them a peer of yours, another person. Like if you're in finance, give them somebody who's a business partner of yours in the organization. Maybe, and again, and give them someone that has worked for you as well, an employee of yours, because it gives them that 360-degree approach, which is, this is what it's like to work for them. This is what it's like to have them work for me. And this is what it's like to work with them in an organization. So I fully appreciate, and I think most hiring authorities would appreciate, even private sector, that you don't want to give people you're currently working with. And I would never ask, unless we're so far down the process that you do that, that we're certain we're going to hire you, and it's just a formality of check. And I think that that's reasonable to say, hey, look, I don't want my current employer to know because you may not hire me. So there's nothing wrong with that. I don't have an expectation, and most employers don't have an expectation you give current people. But to the extent you have someone who's left the organization you trust, and that's part of building your brand, building and managing those relationships so you do have people you can trust and go to as references. And typically organizations look for plus or minus 3 references. I don't think you need to give 15 references. I think that in certain circumstances, again, when the CEO, it might be 3 professional, and because they want to talk to someone in the business community, they want to talk to someone in the faith-based community, and talk to someone in who's an elected official in your community, that may be a case where you end up with more. But by and large, I think 3, professional and from those different categories, it fits the best.
And then, thank you. Okay, then one last one, just popped up, late edition, but any examples or suggested practices for agencies to help prepare their current employees and put them in a pipeline towards the C-suite? Any examples or general advice?
I would tell everybody to go look at BART. BART right now has their own leadership program they've created for their own internal mid-level managers. And so the goal of that is to prepare and get those people ready for executive level positions in the organization. I think if you're looking at your own talent pool and you're trying to figure out ways to keep and retain them, things like that are really valuable. They don't cost you much because, and there's tons of value to organizations like Eno, and value you can't get by doing it yourselves in your own organization, but by doing it in your own organization, they're right there. All they have to do is come down the hall to a conference room, more or less. So to the extent you can give them information, you can prepare them, you can develop some of their skill sets, I think that's a really valuable thing. And then I'd also encourage you to just challenge your employees. Employees, I think we all appreciate, we don't want to be busy to the point we're stressed out and we can't function. But we all appreciate having something to do where we feel like we can add meaningful value to the organization. And so being open and being transparent with employees and saying, look, right now I can't give you a raise, and these are the reasons why, but I can give you responsibility for this, and I'd like you to help me with this. People value that because that's going to help develop and advance their careers also. So I think those are things you can do internally and as an organization to help advance people.
Great. Thanks, Greg, for answering all the questions and for joining us today. I think it was an important topic, and I hope that people got a lot out of it. And again, please follow up with Greg if you like to continue the conversation. Thank you again, everybody, for attending, and we'll talk to you in a few months. Next webinar.
Thank you. Bye-bye.